Konstantin Kisin is a comedian and is the host of the Trigonometry podcast and joins me live on the line. Evening to you, Konstantin. Oh, are you there? We got you.
Yes, we have.
Hello there, Konstantin. How's it going?
Good, very well. How are you, mate?
Fine, thanks. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us tonight here on talkRADIO. So you are a comedian. Should comedy ever have any of these sorts of boundaries? I would understand in day-to-day life if I wanted to wander down the street in blackface for whatever reason, that would be considered quite rightly horrific. Does comedy have any of those sorts of limits? Should it have any of those sorts of limits?
Well, of course, comedy has limits within it, but the issue here isn't so much that. It's do we engage in this sort of cultural revisionism and cultural vandalism, which is what we're really talking about. No one is proposing to remake Little Britain in the way that it was made at the time. The issue is, should we go back and, to use an awkward phrase for this context, whitewash our history? Is that what we're trying to do here? Because it's not just Little Britain, it's now The Mighty Boosh, Gone with the Wind, League of Gentlemen. All of these have now been taken down from various services as quote-unquote problematic. And I don't see how that benefits us. Why don't we look at that and go, well, those were the that's how things were done then. And look, now we are having a nuanced conversation about those issues, and I don't imagine anybody would be making something like Little Britain with blackface now.
Do you then think that perhaps these series, because I know Gone with the Wind has been taken off HBO Max now, as you say, all these other comedies, there are now big question marks over them. Should they be shown with a warning or a context message at the start saying that at the time they were deemed acceptable? Do you think they should be shown with nothing? How would you broadcast them in a way that respects that times have changed without erasing the history?
Well, I mean, when we broadcast Schindler's List, we don't need to give people a warning that this happened in 1944, do we? I don't believe we need to patronize the public. People understand that if something was made 30 or 20 years ago, you will have different standards of what's acceptable and what isn't. I get. I mean, if it was Gone with the Wind and I was watching Gone with the Wind, I would absolutely get that, and I would say, right. Or Tom and Jerry. You know, when you sometimes see some of the slightly stereotypical characters in there, I don't need a warning for that. But what's interesting about what's happening now, which you've alluded to, is that it's actually really modern shows that look like they were made in the last couple of years that we're now talking about being problematic. Now, if we're going to still show them, because they're so modern, I'm worried people won't perhaps understand the context unless there is a warning. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's the right thing. You tell me. People need to man up. People need to man up a little bit. I don't think this culture of being easily offended by everything and hypersensitive to everything, I don't think that's a healthy thing for us as a society. Look, if you watch Little Britain and you don't know that it was made whenever it was made and you get offended by it, well, fine, go and look up when it was made, and then that will contextualize it for you. Why do we need to babysit everybody? Why do we need to give everybody trigger warnings and prime people to tell them that they might be offended by something? One of the interesting things in terms of the research on this, there's a lot of research that shows that if you give people trigger warnings, if you tell people that they might be offended, they're far more likely to actually be offended and hurt by the things that they watch. So I actually think it's massively counterproductive. I think we should teach people to be more resilient in the face of things that might be a little bit uncomfortable. This is our history. It's reality. We can't continue to try and revise our history and pretend that we've always been perfect.
But are we though in a... I mean, I actually broadly agree with you. I really do. I find Little Britain utterly hilarious. It was really rare that there was a TV show that could make me actually bend over holding my stomach with laughter, and Little Britain was one of them. When the first series started, and I'll just say one word to you, Bitty, when I first saw that, I nearly fell off my chair. I mean, I think it's one of the most hilarious things I've ever seen. So I get it, and I love it. But I don't feel comfortable, and maybe I'm too much of a snowflake. Maybe I'm going to be accused of being, Corbyn's best friend. But I feel uncomfortable. I'm more than comfortable saying, right, the gay stuff. As a gay man, I never found that offensive in the slightest, because David was a hilarious character, and I'm smart enough to see that the comedy was on more than one level of just laughing at David. It was laughing at David. It was laughing at David's own insecurities. It was laughing at David having the bigger problem with being gay than anyone else. You were laughing at his outfits. You were laughing at other people's reactions who actually weren't bothered. You were laughing at old people and characters you would never expect to hear using gay slang, using it to him. So it was sophisticated, and it was on more than one level. It was funny, and as a gay person, I found it funny. I have no problem with it. I feel less comfortable saying that about other minorities that I'm not a part of, because is it my place to say whether or not they should be offended?
Right, but this is exactly the point. And look, I certainly wouldn't accuse you of being a snowflake or make any allusions to your political persuasion. I guess what I'm saying is we've come to a place where we've been told that we can only laugh at things that concern us. So, for example, you can only laugh at a gay character, right? And I, being originally from Russia, I can laugh at fun being made of Russians, or Russian accents being made, or Russians being mocked, but not another nationality. I mean, how far do we want to go with this? Like, I watch a Bond film and I see the terrible Russian accents that the Bond villains have, and they're a bit silly sometimes. Do we start to ban that? Is 10 years from now, are we going to say actually Bond films are deeply problematic? I don't see this as a healthy path for us to go down. If you, as a gay man, found the gay character in Little Britain funny, I can promise you, having spoken to many friends, there were lots of black people who found the blackface characters funny. There were lots of women who found, women characters funny. It's this idea that we can only be allowed to laugh at the things that we've got permission to laugh at because we're that thing. I think it's a trick there, and we've had the wool pulled over our eyes about this. I don't think that's how society ought to be.
It is tricky, because I hate sitting on the fence because I get splinters in my backside. But as I said, if people, what's interesting is I haven't actually heard, and I'll be really interested to hear about it, because whilst I'm uncomfortable listening to white people telling the world that it's not offensive, in fairness, it's only white people I've actually heard telling me it is offensive. I've not actually seen one black person or person who is non-white in any of the, and they may have been out there and I've just missed them, but I haven't heard of anyone who is actually one of the ethnicities being parodied coming out and saying this is completely unacceptable.
Right. Well, this is the thing, is there are lots of black people who think both ways on this issue. Just like I'm sure you'll know, there are lots of gay people who feel differently to you about the gay character. There will be some people who maybe felt that it was wrong, or that it was offensive, or they didn't like it at the time. Maybe they didn't watch Little Britain at the time because of that, and yet you found it hilarious. So we're pretending that these so-called communities, like the gay community or the black community, speak with a uniform voice on these issues. They really don't. I mean, I know it will be a surprise to many people, but gay people have their own minds and think different things, and so do black people, and so do women, and so do all these different groups. So we're pretending that all these different groups have the same opinion about this issue. They don't. And there will be some black people who might have been offended, and there will be some black people who found it hilarious. And what I would love for the mainstream media to do a little bit more of is actually bring those different voices on. One of the things we're seeing with the protests right now is the same thing. I know plenty of black people. I could give you a list of 20 names of the people who oppose the protests that are happening right now. And they're prominent commentators, comedians, journalists, rappers, etc. But I don't ever see them on television. I don't ever hear from them on radio, because they're not given the opportunity to put their case forward.
Well, no, absolutely. And
from those people when they have the quote-unquote right opinion.
And just to say, by the way, at the very start of this program, and I'll say it again, I really, really want to hear from people who are the victims, the people who are being parodied in Little Britain, to find out whether you find it funny. I, as a gay man, found David hilarious. Is there a non-white person who perhaps found Dolores hilarious? I mean, the thing about Dolores is, yes, he's blacking up as her, but he's so hideous, and it's so ridiculous what he looks like, that to me it's almost it's like Bo Selector, actually. It's beyond parody. It's gone past it. I don't think you could say that he's trying to look like a genuine black woman. Can you?
No, but that's the whole point, is that the whole show is based around the premise of these two people dress up as different characters, and that is maintained throughout. So it's not like they could have got a black person to play that character, which is why they did the blackface. Do you understand what I'm saying?
No, absolutely. The comedy is how ridiculous they look, how unconvincing actually that they look, how shocking it is, because part of it's the shock factor, but also I really do worry that we're going to end up in a situation that we're going to end up with no comedy. And I don't mean to say that no one's ever going to make any again, but comedy is not kind. The whole point of comedy, when you look at its earliest roots, and I don't need to tell you as a comedian, but, you know, you laugh at the person falling over. You laughed in silent movies because, you know, they got hit on the head with the ladder. Well, that's not very kind. And are we going to end up in a situation where anyone who's been injured by a ladder or fallen off a stool is then going to complain that comedy's taking the mickey out of them? Comedy is unkind, isn't it?
Amen. And I've been trying to get this message across. I don't know, so you may be aware, and your listeners may be aware, they might remember that about a year and a half ago, I was asked to sign a safe space behavioral agreement contract by a university to perform there, which said that they had a zero tolerance policy on racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-religion, anti-atheism, and also demanded that all jokes must be respectful and kind. So we are starting to move in that direction.
None of that is comedy. None of that is comedy. The whole point, because I genuinely believe that everything should be right for comedy. And again, I say this cautiously because I don't want to speak on behalf of people who may be offended that I don't feel I can represent. But in general, nothing should be off limits for comedy. One of my favourite stories, and again on paper, if you'd have heard it at the time, you'd have probably been horrified. But one of my favourite stories is that Joan Rivers, on the night of September the 11th, was in underground comedy clubs in New York making jokes about which members of the presidency should have stuck in the Twin Towers. Now, it's that's horrific on paper, but precisely, in my opinion, what comedy should be. Do you think that this kind of censorship is going to scare comedians going forward? Is it going to restrict comedians from feeling like they can do what they're best at, and that is push the envelope, push the boundary?
Of course, and you know, if you're someone who's a member of the general public, maybe not paying a huge amount of attention, you've got a busy life, etc., you might not be aware of this, but actually this process has been happening for decades now. And this creeping authoritarianism is, of course, it's affecting comedy. If you speak to comedians, particularly comedians who are on TV a lot, who have a big audience, who are in the public eye, who are, you know, in the eye of the paparazzi or the media, etc., they'll tell you, you know, the kind of things they'll say to you backstage is, you know, the joke that's going to end my career is already out there.
Wow. Okay.
So everybody knows what the climate is. The climate is you make one mistake and that's your career over. And so there are a lot of comedians who live in permanent terror of being cancelled for telling the wrong joke. Because you see, the problem is that now, of course, you know, not only are we deeply unforgiving as a society, but also we have an everlasting memory because everything is recorded, everything is published, everything is on social media. So you can say, you I'm sure remember the Chris Rock controversy when he was found to have made some homophobic tweets 10 years and therefore didn't get to host the Oscars. So you can say something 10 years ago, which you know may be wrong, but it was perfectly kind of within the acceptable discourse at the time. And then 10 years later, suddenly you find yourself losing work or being cancelled or having your reputation destroyed. And we all know this. We all know that, you know, you watch, like, I mean, one of my favorite series and my wife's favorite series kind of 10, 15 years ago was Friends. And there's been articles in the last couple of years talking about how Friends was racist and homophobic and transphobic and whatever else. Now, Friends, I'm sure most people will agree, was a pretty innocuous series. And yet people find themselves being offended by it. So we've been operating in this environment for a long time, and I'm afraid it's only going to get worse.
All right. Just on a flip side of this, though, Kevin Hart the reason that he had this sort of council culture around him was that he sent tweets talking about how if he had a gay son, he would break a dollhouse over his head if he saw him playing with it. He also called a person's profile picture a gay billboard for AIDS, and various other jokes that were made as well. He also made some jokes in his Seriously Funny special about preventing his son from being gay.
Right.
I mean, in fairness...
So let me ask you this, before you set that up, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
What do you think the target of those jokes are? Do you think that Kevin Hart there is joking at the expense of gay people? Or do you think that he's joking at his own expense and revealing his own, the element of homophobia that many people feel?
Do you know what? It would depend to me, and I didn't see the routine, so it's not an answer I can give easily, but it would depend to me. You're right, because taking one quote and taking that as the whole routine is perhaps not right to do that. I would need to see whether there was a payoff within that gag where he has egg on his face. Now, if the joke is, if my son's gay, I'm going to put a dollhouse on his head, then I don't think that's funny. And I do actually think that to put that out there to your perhaps predominantly straight audience is not useful. If the joke is, I would put break a doll's house on my son's head, and probably a piece of it would hit me in the face because I'm a fool and I'm the idiot, and actually, my son is going to be brilliant, then that would be fine, because I think when it does come to jokes about minorities, and I don't think things should be off limits, but I think in 2020 we need to be more sophisticated about who the butt of the joke is. Ricky Gervais is brilliant at this because he will have racism right, left and centre in his comedies, but you're not laughing at the person who's being abused, you're laughing at the person making the outrageous statement. And if it's as long as the minority isn't the butt of that joke, personally, I think it's fine to make those kinds of jokes.
Exactly. Well, it sounds to me like you've thought about this very carefully, and you have a very, very healthy attitude to it, which is exactly my point in terms of the Kevin Hart thing. Like you say, in 2020, we should be more sophisticated, but he didn't say those things in 2020. And the other point you make very well as well is the context is everything. And so the problem we have with the cancel culture is nobody looks at the context of what he said at the time, right? We just take that quote out of context, we present it as a thing, and then based on that, we demand apologies.
And by the way, I don't know. I mean, it might have been that gay people were the butt of that joke, in which case, he was right to be pulled up on it, and he needs to be a bit more sophisticated going forward. That's something I don't know the answer to, but to me, those are the sorts of rules.
But my point is something else.
Yeah.
My point is something else. That happened 10 years ago when the whole environment was very different. And I'll be honest with you, look, and you'll know this from your own experience. I don't know how old you are, but I'm in my 30s. When I was growing up as a kid,
a tiny bit.
When we were at school, right? When you were at school, the word "gay" was used in a completely inappropriate way by modern standards. People would say, "Oh, you like painting, or that's gay." Right now, that's deeply unacceptable, right? In our modern environment. But at the time we were growing up, it was part of the way that people talked. Now, nobody would defend that now, but we have to understand the historical context of the way that those conversations happened then. So, do we cancel every single person who said, you like painting, that's gay in 1985? Is that what we do?
No, I get it. I get it. And if you are someone who is prepared to say a few years later, you know what? Yeah, I did say that, and I wouldn't say it now, which in fairness, Matt Lucas and David Walliams have done when it came to their characters. Actually, I wonder if that is enough to draw a line under it. Just one more thing I want to ask you. I know we've got to get to a break, but just totally coincidentally, from a friend I've not spoken to in ages, he sent me today, not knowing at all that I was going to talk to you tonight on this programme, he sent me a link to one of your tweets today. And it was a really interesting perspective regarding the Black Lives Matter protests, in which you were saying that essentially people, well, I'll let you explain better, but it was essentially people have the right to protest, but we need to be careful because actually if we keep ripping down these statues, we are actually going to give rise to the far right trying to come out and protect all of these statues, and it's going to lead to some unholy mess. I mean, will you explain your position? Because I found it quite fascinating.
Yeah, I want to correct something you said because it's a very sensitive issue.
Please do.
And I don't want people to get the wrong impression. I think it's very important.
Yep.
I was not talking about ripping down the statues of slave owners, and I want to be very clear about that. I don't think that those statues should be up, although I do think the way to deal with those statues is through the democratic process. In other words, a decision made by our elected officials,
I agree,
as opposed to a mob that goes down and decides what to rip down. But that was not what I was talking about, just to be clear.
Okay.
What I said was that if we continue to see scenes where these mobs, deface Winston Churchill statues and say that Winston Churchill was a racist and spray paint that on his statue, if we continue to see scenes of young people burning the British flag on the cenotaph, if we continue to see these hugely important symbols of British history and British civilization being defaced and being tarred in this way, then what you will see is the emergence of groups that seek to protect that. And of course, the very people who are going to try to protect that first are going to be the people who are up for a fight, and you know exactly who those people are. They're going to be angry young men, white men, let's be honest, who are going to come and, under the slogan of defending these statues, going to get into conflicts with the Black Lives Matter protesters. They're going to get into conflicts with the police. And we know for a fact that, the way that this has been reported in the mainstream media, they will not be treated in the same way that the protesters who are there now will be treated. And that will lead to a never-ending spiral, which I don't think ends in a healthy place at all, because what will happen is there'll be a crackdown. A lot of people will side with the protesters who are defending these very important monuments. Let's be very clear, by the way. Winston Churchill is a British hero. And whatever you may say about his views on whatever else, he is a man that saved this country and saved the Western world from fascism. And I say this as someone who I'm British, but I'm first-generation immigrant. I moved here when I was 13. I'm very proud to be Russian. I'm also very proud to be British. And this idea that Winston Churchill is somehow a symbol of everything that's wrong with this country, I think that's disgusting.
God, do you know what? Honestly, Konstantin, I could talk to you for absolutely hours, because it's rarely I agree with people so much. I couldn't agree more. Churchill wasn't perfect, but if you're moronic enough to not appreciate that actually the reason you're able to stand there and protest is because of him, then I'm afraid, perhaps you're not intelligent enough to comment.